guys! I hope my headphones are working. So I'm just gonna wait for some more followers to come on. Alrighty. So we have a very special guest today, someone who has almost become synonymous with the movement. So please sit tight while I invite. That rhymed. Okay. Here we go. Been sent, so hi.
Hey, Monica, how's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing very well.
Thank you for joining us today. And so everyone, this is Dhaliwal, and he is a name that's, become almost synonymous with the movement. And you and the Poetic Justice Foundation, Ask India Why. When I started like tweeting and talking about it, about the Morcha and what was going on in India on Twitter, I didn't know that, Ask India Why was something that was started by Poetic Justice, but that's how I started on it. And later, I found out that that was something that Poetic Justice had brought forth. So I would like you to introduce yourself and just let us know, what is it that you do and what Poetic Justice is about and how it came about.
For sure. So a little bit about myself. My name is Mo Dhaliwal. I got involved in community and cultural spaces originally actually through Punjabi folk arts. Years ago, I started a Bhangra festival out in Vancouver called VIBC, the Vancouver International Bhangra Celebration. And that was my first sort of intersection with our Punjabi community in any meaningful way. My background was actually in technology. I worked for a number of years in advertising, and then later I started a digital agency called Skyrocket. And at Skyrocket, we were working with our clients all the time to develop compelling messages and develop campaigns. So when the farmers' protest started, it made sense for us to bring some of our talents to this campaign and say, okay, what can we do to clarify some of this messaging and help the diaspora get active? And it actually coincided with the inception of Poetic Justice Foundation. This group was founded by me and my lifelong friend Anita Lal, and she's been practically like family for most of my life, but also a conspirator on many of our campaigns and work in the community. So last March, we were sitting here thinking that we have so much experience in working in community and in doing governance and working in not-for-profit spaces, structurally almost, that we wanted to build a new vehicle for ourselves to be able to go into the community and do advocacy in really, really unapologetic ways. So we decided to form our own charitable organization called the Poetic Justice Foundation. And really our purpose was to challenge structures of oppression and discrimination, do some grassroots advocacy, and bring content and workshops to our community, the South Asian diaspora, to help us reconcile some of the issues our community might have, right? So one of our first events that we did was called Dalits and Jats, and we wanted to talk about the issues of caste and how they continue to persist in diaspora and how they continue to inflict harm in diaspora. We did some talks on anti-Blackness in the South Asian community. We talked about unpacking the issue of Khalistan and the taboo and trauma that surrounds it. It's a very loaded word for so many people. So we wanted to unpack that and help the community actually have a safe space to have dialogue around that. And then as we were coming into the fall, we saw what was happening with the farmers' protest. And we said, hey, here's another issue that's actually relevant to diasporic communities. So let's get to work and do what we do and see how we can lend our support here.
Okay, so Poetic Justice is now just a year old, then that means.
Almost. On March 23rd, it'll be our 1-year birthday.
Well, a happy early birthday to Poetic Justice. Okay, so what about Ask India Why? How did that come about?
Mm-hmm. So what happened was, we were looking at all of the protest action happening in the diaspora. And we saw so much activity, right? There was so much like josh and energy from our communities, thousands of people coming out, these massive rallies in New York, San Francisco, Vancouver, Toronto. And the message was, no farmers, no food, standing in solidarity with farmers. And these were incredibly inspirational moments for our community. But what we noticed was that the wider community, the wider public, was having difficulty unpacking our message, right? They could see that we stood with farmers, but they didn't know why that was important, right? They saw the signs that said no farmers, no food, but they didn't necessarily understand what that meant, right? So, my background's in marketing and brand communications. So I said, okay, we need a better brand for this to help the wider community actually understand the violence that's actually taking place, right? And it was difficult doing that with, any other singular statement. We said, okay, whenever you come up with a statement, it's hard to capture everything in a statement, right? Because the statement is singular. So if it's no farmers, no food, that's so specific that it's hard for maybe other communities of oppression or other groups to embrace that. So we said, let's flip it on its head. And we're not going to make a statement. We're going to ask a question. And we're going to ask a question in such a way that anybody can actually embrace this message. So Ask India Why is something that could be embraced by Kashmiris, right? Because Kashmir, as we know, is an open air jail and people are facing violence and oppression there. So Ask India Why is something that's relevant to them. Ask India Why is relevant to anybody that was affected by CAA. It's relevant to the Dalit communities that face violence and women especially that face sexual violence continually. And bringing it to our farmers' protest, Ask India Why is something that could be relevant to the farmers, right? So through that, we were able to actually take the farmers' protest and make it a function of a wider message, and the wider message being, why is India so violent, right? Why is it killing off its minorities? Why is it killing off its own democracy? So we just wanted to ask that question.
Okay, speaking of democracy, so for the last, since I want to say 2019, or actually since when Modi's come into office, we've seen the decline of democracy through CAA, through a more Hindutva kind of nation emerging because of him. However, when we had the CAA protest, or even the protest against love jihad, we didn't see them pick up the way the farmers' protest has. And yes, Ask India Why, I believe, has had a huge role to play in it. Why do you think the farmers' protest has garnered international attention, while the other protests that have happened and the other things that have gone on, while being even more kind of oppressing, has not?
I actually think that it's, I'm trying to say this without having an ego about being a part of the Punjabi community. I'm going to do my best here. But I think you really have to look at the Punjabis and the Sikh inspiration of the Morcha in Delhi, right? And this is a bit of a contentious issue because when you mention Sikhi in these spaces, you hear all sorts of challenges of like, oh, don't make it about religion. This isn't Punjabi only. And there's this kind of continual, need to erase Punjabiyat and erase Sikhi from the front lines of the Morcha. But when you look at it, actually, frankly speaking, that's the only difference, right? Is that you have a community and a population that has like the technology of resistance, right? They have the technology of revolution embedded within their culture, right? And when they show up the way that they do, and I'm not saying it's exclusionary, it's not a Sikh only event, obviously, it's not a Punjabi only Morcha, obviously, because otherwise you wouldn't have millions of people all over India, standing in support and protesting as well. But we're like the most problematic population for India, right? So they tend to crack down on us hardest because when you have a community within your borders, within your invented borders, when you have a community whose job it is to live in a constant state of revolution, that's a highly problematic group, right? Whenever you're trying to construct a system of oppression, this group is going to be a pain in your ass all the time, right? So I think we have to give credit to the Babbe and Bibiyan that have been on the front lines for months, right? It was the sheer level of energy and commitment that they brought to this and sustained for so long that it simmered long enough for it to actually start leaking out into the wider context, right? It simmered long enough to bring the whole thing to a boil. And I think that was actually missing from the CAA. And I do believe that was also missing, unfortunately, from even Article 370 and the Kashmir issue.
So I always say that our elders have a very quiet resilience and a quiet strength. And you brought this up, in other words, that, because for me, the protests in Punjab have been going on since September, and they moved into Delhi around Thanksgiving, and I actually became involved because of the reactions of my grandmothers and my grandmother, and it was due to the many other traumas that our community as a whole have faced. And we always talk about what has happened to our community in a very negative way, but we underestimate the strength that it has given to our grandparents. And the reason why that this Morcha has moved forward is because of their resilience and their strength. I want to ask you that when you look at this, I mean, what do you see? Like when I see our grandparents, I feel bad. But like, what do you see? Like everybody has their own opinion of what's happening and the prejudice and the oppressions that are happening.
Mm-hmm. So I think sometimes we have a very like Western view of inspiration and where inspiration is supposed to come from, right? And we talk about the future, and we often look rightfully, I think, to the youth, and we say, okay, they're what's next, they're the future, that's where inspiration is going to come from. But for me, watching, our elders on the front lines of the Morcha, like it's lit me on fire, right? It's lit everybody around me on fire. Our inspiration is completely tied to the movement of our elders, right? And it's one of those moments where I think there's a necessary, maybe even cultural correction here, where too often we start believing the story that the oppressor tells about us, right? We start believing that like, oh, Punjab, unbarred, backwards, this, that, the other. And it's like, how can a population be considered unbarred or backwards when they had such a nuanced understanding of what was being done to them? Mm-hmm. That understanding was immediate, right? Mm-hmm. It was forward looking, right? They looked at those 3 farm bills, and it was actually with a lambi soch and a deeply nuanced understanding that they knew what was about to be done to them, right? Mm-hmm. We recognize oppression because we faced it so often. Mm-hmm. So it was with this intelligence, with this wisdom, and with this knowledge that they undertook this action, right? Mm-hmm. And it was inspiring as a result of that. And then further to that, you bring the Sikh inspiration to the Morcha, and there's lots of protests that happen all over the place. And the word protest, unfortunately, doesn't capture what our people did and what they are doing, right? Mm-hmm. They showed up to the borders of Delhi, and they didn't just undertake a protest. They proceeded to build Begumpura on site, right? They proceeded to eradicate sorrow on site, right? Delhi was, it's been called in some articles, the festival of starving children, right? And our people showed up to this festival of starving children and proceeded to nourish, educate, help, shelter people on mm-hmm. site, right? Mm-hmm. This isn't typical for protest action, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is also my challenge to people that, will often say, oh, it's not about Punjabis, oh, it's not about Sikhs, it's just about the farm laws, don't complicate it. And it's like, well, actually, it's not, because if it was just about the farm laws, people would go there and say, yo, we're not here to do anything else. We're just here for the farm laws. But they're not, right? Yeah. They showed up with langar, with generosity. They built libraries. They built themselves a mall. They mm-hmm. showed up with generous hearts and invited everybody in, and they built Begumpura on site, right? That is a movement, right? That isn't just about the farm laws anymore. That's saying that there's a way of life here that mm-hmm. is going to persist, that you're seeking to eradicate.
Yeah. So just a background to people who don't understand what Begumpura is. In Sikhi, in the Guru Granth Sahib, Begumpura is referred to a city without sorrows. And it's a city where, not of wish fulfillment, of where there isn't hunger, there isn't a socioeconomic class. And it's brought up a lot that when the Morcha started, there wasn't a caste system. Everybody lived together. Everybody's living there together. Everybody's eating together. Everybody is kind of pooling whatever they have to make ends meet. And when we see that, it's almost like an idealistic society. So that's where the term Begumpura comes from. Okay, so Mo, you brought up another point that our elders in our community was able to recognize what was going on, right? They were able to recognize what these bills were doing. So I want to get into the background of this, because for centuries now, Punjab has been targeted, right? And whether it is the waters of the Ravi and Bihas, or splitting Punjab up, or trying to take away the language as they are by making Hindi mandatory in schools, or kind of changing the narrative about our religion or Punjab's history, that people understand what's going on. Now, when it comes to controlling narrative, sorry, I just heard myself in my ear. When it comes to controlling the narrative and fighting back here, how do you think we need to move forward with that? How do you think we, as people sitting outside of India, can help? Whether it's like talking about what happened in the past, what's happening now.
So I think the thing that we need to continue with is sharing this idea forward, right? Sharing the idea forward of what Punjab is and what Sikhi is, right?
Hmm.
I mean, it took me a long time to actually understand, the importance of like Shahidi, right? And why the Shahids were martyring themselves.
Hmm.
And it was because they didn't have the same impatience that we do, right? Quite often when we talk about social change or human rights and the change that we want to see, we are actually kind of impatient about it, right? We want to see the change in front of our eyes, right? We want it
Hmm.
to be immediate. And when we want that change to be immediate, we get a little impatient, and we start compromising, right?
Hmm.
People around us tell us, "Oh no, no, this isn't realistic. That's not realistic," right? And that realism is really just rooted in impatience, right? We say if we can't see that change in 1, 2, 3 years, then it's not real, right?
Hmm.
But our shaheeds, our martyrs, our story is about projecting an idea centuries into the future, right? They
Hmm.
martyred themselves not because they were trying to create change in the moment, but because they
Hmm.
wanted to light a fire
Hmm.
of wisdom, a light a fire of spirit
Hmm.
in their people for generations to come, right?
Hmm.
So I think the thing that we need to do is actually eradicate the impatience, right? And say that the change that we're looking for, the type of society we're looking for, it might not even show up in our lifetimes. And that's okay, right?
Yeah.
These things sometimes take time. It's
Yeah.
important for us to light a fire that is going to last for generations and make moves that are going to last for generations. It's okay if we don't see it in our lifetime, but let's work on it.
Actually, that's a very correct concept. Because if you look at it, like if you look at Bhagat Singh died before India was actually free, but because of his sacrifice, it propelled something else. Yeah. I want to get into you and your life because you said you started in working in the community by starting a Bhangra competition, right?
Mhm.
And I'm a firm believer that like in order to keep your heritage alive and move it forward, you need your language, you need your religion, and you need your culture. And I think Bhangra competitions are they complete two of them, right? Bhangra is part of our culture and heritage, and the Punjabi language it keeps it alive. So where
Mhm.
did that idea come from, and how did you get involved in that?
Yeah, so an interesting thing happened. I was living in California in the early 2000s, and post 9/11, there was this sort of phenomenon, and they studied it years later, but like in the 2003 to 2005 kind of time zone, there was all sorts of cultural institutions popping up all over the place, right? And I'm not just talking about Punjabi, I'm talking about like many marginalized communities started creating these cultural groups, right? And there was a spike of them. And the reason for that was because in the post 9/11 world, America was using its power to flex, frankly, and kind of reconfiguring the world for us. And in
Mm-hmm.
reaction to that, many of us were trying to find our own place of belonging and trying to find our own place of identity, right? So I moved from California back to Vancouver, and I kind of wrestled with this for a few years to say, even in a place like Vancouver, I was used to or I started witnessing microaggressions. I started seeing outright, racism take place, and it just blew my mind because I'm like, for a community that's been here for a century or longer, right? How the hell are we still being treated like this in downtown Vancouver? So when we first started the Bhangra Festival, it was actually as a means of taking up space, right? So I didn't necessarily see it as a Punjabi movement originally. It was more so to, go into the heart of the Raj of, the Gore in Vancouver, right? And say, we're going to plant our chanda in the middle of all of this, right? And we did, right? And for many years, our festival ran in the middle of the downtown core, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we took some criticism from the Punjabi community because they were like, how can you do a Punjabi event and it's not in the heart of Surrey because that's where the Punjabis are?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we're right in some of that critique. And what I found over time was that, as much as there was an importance in taking up space, there was also a little bit of internalized racism, in our work as well,
Mm-hmm.
where we were trying to be as good as the Gore, right? We were trying to find legitimacy amongst all the white institutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for a time we did, right? It was like, the multicultural councils and the various granting authorities kind of patted us on the head and said, wow, look at all these model minorities running around doing the right thing. But after a time, we came to realize as well that the work actually has to go deeper than that. It's not just about us performing our identities and trying to, look the part.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually more important for us to connect and seed, the next generation of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the festival evolved over time, and it actually turned into a different movement. Like I left it, over 5 years ago, but it turned into a different movement called 5X. So its current expression, right, which is a little bit more like by South Asian for South Asian, I think is a little bit more, it's a lot more liberated actually, right? It's a lot more free, it's a lot more expressive, and it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have the hangups that we had of trying to kind of please the audiences of our geography, right?
Mm-hmm.
But early on, it was very much just an attempt at finding belonging for myself, actually, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if I find belonging, then hopefully others can find belonging through it as well.
That's interesting that you bring that up. I always say that it's the heartbreak of the diaspora, and this is something I felt when I lived in India and I used to work there. That it's the heartbreak of the diaspora that we don't really fit in America or Canada, but we don't really fit in when we go back to India because, you know, like I can't even drink the water from there. Like I need bottles of water, like bottled water. But do you feel that as members of the diaspora that we have internalized inferiority? Do we have inferiority complexes?
I would say far less so these days.
Yeah,
Yeah, because I mean, I think there was a generation that was looking for legitimacy all the time, right?
yeah.
And legitimacy meant, there was one generation where legitimacy went, wearing a three-piece suit, um, you know, going into one of the noble professions, right? Be a doctor, a lawyer, something like that. And again, that was trying to find, this legitimacy in these white spaces, right?
Yeah.
And these days, what we're seeing is that people are actually, far more expressive and I think liberated, where there's not as much need to be patted on the back necessarily by these structures of power, which is why they're actually standing up to them and calling them out, right? We have,
Mm-hmm.
I think more young people working in social justice spaces. And even
Mm-hmm.
if they're not working in social justice spaces, they're at least aware of what racial privilege looks like, right? Where their communities might themselves be complicit in oppression and where they're also being oppressed. So I think these days there's a lot more room and appetite for complexity, right? And those complexities are beautiful because I think in those complexities is where you have the facets of the diamond, right? And the shiniest diamonds are the ones that have the most facets cut into them, right? And so I think our community, especially in diaspora, has the potential to have so many facets,
Mm-hmm.
and in some ways, I think has a greater and broader perspective even than communities out of Punjab, or I would say just mainstream white communities in North America. Like one of my favorite sayings is that for a long time we grew up thinking that there's two Punjabs, right, east and west. But I think the beauty actually lies in the third Punjab, right? And the third Punjab lays like lace over the entire planet, right? And kind of going back to the Ask India Why campaign, even, our first work in even that campaign was to go for the third Punjab, right? Our earliest meetings were conducted with people from Malaysia, Denmark, Netherlands, Australia, UK. And some of these calls, we had 70, 80 people that were part of this third Punjab, right? That was coming together. And I think we've witnessed the collective power of that group.
That's actually really beautiful to hear. The third Punjab, that even though we're outside of Punjab, we're still Punjabi, and being Punjabi unites us. So now that you bring this up, conventionally, most South Asian brown parents want their kids to be doctors, lawyers, engineers. But you're into social justice. So how did that happen, and what did your parents have to say about it?
I think my dad actually understood implicitly a little bit more what I was trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, he passed away before things really got going. But my mom was confused by most of it for like most of my life, right? With the Bhangra Festival, my family was clueless. They were like, why are you volunteering all your time in something that doesn't quote unquote make you money, right? Because if it doesn't make you money, it's useless, right? And they couldn't understand, right? And and that's okay. Like, there was a time that I would struggle to explain. And then, there came a time when I realized that it's hard to explain to them that these are the fruits of the privilege that they provided, right? That I have the privilege of not having to worry about survival daily, right? That I can work in these
Mm-hmm.
spaces. And
Mm-hmm.
whenever you have differences in privileges, sometimes that's a tough chasm to bridge, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think my mom gets it more now. And I'm not even kidding here. It was the vanities of getting accolades from the wider community and from my own community that I think did it for her. After a while, she was like, okay, I'm proud of you. You're not wasting your time.
Yeah.
But I think if it wasn't for those accolades, I think to this day, she'd be like, stop wasting your time. You're ruining your life. But I think it was, it took some time to bridge that.
I can actually, I know exactly what you're saying because when I first tried to get into acting, like my parents were just like, "What are you doing?" Like they didn't let me go to like theater school or anything. But like once I did get into film and people started congratulating them, I think that's where when they got on board. And I do think for Indian parents that's a big thing because um I feel like our parents came here and they fought so hard to have like a standing in a society where I, that they were always shut down. And like my dad had to redo all of his schooling because they didn't recognize his degrees. And I know a lot of brown parents had to go through that.
Hmm.
So, I mean, you're absolutely right that they have allotted us the privilege, but I also firmly believe that a lot of their concerns come from like, okay, we worked so hard. We don't want our kids to have to work so hard.
Hmm. And I hear this sometimes with my nieces and nephews these days, right? And I think that there's a danger in that as well, right? Because in Punjabi, the idea of being a jujaru, right, of being one who struggles, right, and one who finds joyful struggles. I think our parents perhaps had struggles that weren't so joyful, right? Because it was very survival based. And what I tell, my cousins or my nieces and nephews these days is that it's not about not struggling. It's
Hmm.
about identifying and finding joyful struggles for yourself, right? Because
Hmm.
it's a human condition of wanting to overcome and achieve something. And
Hmm.
so if we can find joyful and interesting struggles for ourselves, right, I think
Hmm.
that's where the beauty is, and that's where we have the opportunity to actually, um, live up to the potential that our parents gave us by coming to these countries, right?
Hmm.
Because on some level, and this is again going back to the Ask and DOI and farmers protest, on some level, we're all social cultural refugees, actually, right?
Hmm.
Why did our parents go to diaspora if India and Punjab were so great? And the reality is they weren't, right?
They weren't.
There was so much oppression there, they had to leave, right? And so if they came here, then our job is to not undertake the same struggles they did, right?
Hmm.
And it isn't to just live a lofty life of no struggle, but it's to actually find joyful and interesting new struggles
Hmm.
that we can embrace for ourselves.
I agree with that. If life in India was so great, they wouldn't have had to come here. Um, I want to take it back. I want to take it back to the farmers' protest, and I would like to ask you, when you started advocating for the farmers' protest, where did you think the farmers' protest, like, how did you think it was going to unfold, and how has it, like, in what directions did it end up going, and like, could you have predicted this or not?
Um, so we did predict Rihanna and Greta Thunberg because that is very hard to predict. So we didn't predict that, right? I didn't predict that I'd be turned into public enemy in India. Like that stuff wasn't predictable. But the thing that we did predict, and this is last December, keep in mind, right? Like the protests have been going for a couple of weeks, and by about mid-December, after seeing a couple of these car rallies, I turned to my colleagues and said, this is going to go longer than
Hmm.
anybody realizes.
Hmm.
There will be violence because that's India's pattern. There will
Hmm.
be crackdowns against journalism because that's India's pattern.
Hmm.
And people are going to be violated and jailed needlessly. There will be huge crackdowns on dissent, right?
Hmm.
So even the original strategy documents that we put together and we started sharing in January, they listed out these points.
Hmm.
And that campaign was meant to be about bringing the world's attention to India, right? And that
Hmm.
was it. It was ask India why. Let's just get everybody scrutinizing India so that it makes it hard for the government to enact mass violence, right?
Hmm.
And I was actually critiqued at the time because people were like, "Oh, you're distracting from the message. It should just be about the farm bills, et cetera, et cetera." And my retort to that was, even if the farm bills get repealed tomorrow, it doesn't mean that our people are suddenly living beautiful lives, right? It doesn't
Hmm.
mean that their livelihoods are suddenly protected, right? The
Hmm.
government, even if they repeal these three bills, they'll introduce another bill. They'll introduce five more next year, right? What are we going
Hmm.
to do? Take up a Morcha every time? It's not
Hmm.
sustainable, right?
Hmm.
So in diaspora, I thought, the only thing we can affect is we can bring the world's attention to India and just put
Hmm.
India under a spotlight, right? Just a
Hmm.
glaring spotlight in this moment
Hmm.
so that it makes it a little bit more awkward for them
Hmm.
to enact mass violence, right?
Hmm.
I mean, they've still been violent, right? They've still been violent with individuals, but I
Hmm.
honestly believe that that tweet from Rihanna,
Hmm.
I think she saved thousands of lives in the years to
Hmm.
come, right? Only because of the scrutiny, only because everybody's paying attention, the entire world, the media environment, human rights organizations, everybody's looking at India
Hmm.
and saying, let's actually take a look at this so-called democracy and see what's up, right?
Hmm.
And I don't think that would have happened if there wasn't that general attention. So India's response, we predicted, right? We thought that they were going to be treating the protesters very badly,
Hmm.
but there was no way for us to predict that they would focus so much of their time and attention on us specifically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually I agree with you a lot because I was actually in a Telegram group when like everyone's like, "Oh, we should use this hashtag Ask India Why," and I was like, "Oh, like why?" You know, the conversation. I think this was after 26 January, and
Hmm.
everybody was panicking, right? We didn't know what was going to happen. The news coming out was horrible, and everyone was like, "Use this because if we know." So I find Modi and Trump and people like them to be very weak, and a weak man is always sensitive to criticism. So if someone's sensitive to criticism and that's kind of like their Achilles heel, you hit at that. And I think
Hmm.
that's exactly what Ask India Why did that why did. Both of them very sensitive to criticism, and you're absolutely right. Brought in eyes, and the eyes saved us.
Yeah.
Because there was nothing like look at what they did with the CAA protesters. They lathi charged like women who were like on a fat like they were fasting to get CAA revoked, or like at the university, I forgot what university it was. So yes, India is prone to do that, and I think you're absolutely correct with that. Rihanna in that one tweet saved a lot of lives. Now, on the 26th, how do you think January 26th changed the trajectory of the Morcha?
I think there was a moment where, people were getting a little disheartened.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a moment where people started believing the messages of the oppressor, right? But I think that moment was brief. And again, we're born and raised in democracies. So for us, it's really weird to go to a government and ask for their permission to protest, right? And, unfortunately, I'm going to be a little critical of some of the leadership of the Mocha, from the Kisan unions, where they went to the government to try to turn the tractor rally into a parade route, right? And I think for a brief period, there was an attempt by the government to almost co-opt the rally and turn it from a protest to being, some sort of, pro-government thing, right? By turning it into a parade that they were going to
Mm-hmm.
include into the Republic Day.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not correct when you're undertaking civil disobedience, when you're undertaking a protest to actually resist the very government that's protesting you, right? Or the very
Mm-hmm.
government that's oppressing you. And so when people broke from that pre-approved route, right? I didn't see anything wrong with that because this is a civil disruption, right? This is a
Mm-hmm.
protest after all. But the
Mm-hmm.
idea that we had our own people criticizing some in the community for going outside the approved route, that blew my
Mm-hmm.
mind. It's like you're critiquing the wrong people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And same thing with the Red Fort, the Red Fort incident. It was like you had people in our community critiquing Deep Sidhu, critiquing the people that showed up and said, it was wrong. It's like this is civil disruption. What's wrong with undertaking a symbolic act to remind the central government of who we are and say, you haven't been listening to us for months. We're going to
Mm-hmm.
stand in a place that you have to look at us and you have to face us and you have to recognize us, right? For
Mm-hmm.
anybody undertaking civil disruption, it was highly symbolic and it was a beautiful event. But the fact that we had people in our own community critiquing that, right, and criticizing it, that to me was just a sign of some of the internalized oppression in our community, right? To say that we're going to turn to each other and start critiquing each other rather than pointing our fingers at the people that are actually enacting the violence, and that's the government,
Mm-hmm.
right? To point our fingers at the media environment that's committing violences against us, right? So I think for a split second, there was some divisive language showing up and we were starting to fall for it.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, when the government got violent again after the 26th, I think our people rallied again and said, no, we are now once again reminded of who the violent party is and who
Mm-hmm.
the oppressive party is, and that's the government of India.
Yeah. I think the government of India has multiple times kind of stepped on their own toes, or like they've messed it up for themselves. I think the 28th when they attacked the protesters at Singhu, I think they weren't expecting for all the videos and everything that happened there to go viral. It did. And I do agree that that helped us change back the narrative to actually what is going on. Secondly, I always like to mention that the Red Fort is no longer belongs to the government of India. It belongs to the Dalmias. So, they were calling it an insurrection in the media, in the Godi media, but you can't have an insurrection on private property. Like, I remember a lot of people, like I know in my own community here, when I posted about it, how messed up the Indian media was and telling everyone to call their congressman, like there were uncles that were like, Monica, are you crazy? What's the difference between this and the insurrection? And pretty much that it didn't happen on government property. And people don't understand that the Red Fort has been leased out to the Dalmias, and the Dalmias make a lot of money off of it. And and nobody understands why that's messed up, because when you have a heritage site, and if it really is that important, why are people allowed to profit off of it, right? Like, how would you feel if you found out that was happening at the Darbar Sahib? Like, we'd like our insides would get ripped out, right?
Yeah.
And people are so sensitive that there was a Nishan Sahib on a flagpole there without understanding that the real violation is actually what Modi's done to it.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's like, if like addressing the disinformation from Godi media, like that's almost something that it's not even like worthwhile, because they just invent so much stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so those invented stories are problematic, trying to chase down every single one. But I think that's where we just need to focus on our communities and our alignment around these actions, right? And understanding that, whether, let's just suppose for a second it was a government property. Let's just go that way even, right? Even if the Red Fort was a government property, it's still not an insurrection, right? Because what happened at the Capitol in the US was a democratic election happened. And then you had supporters of the previous president trying to enact a type of coup to keep him in power, right? There's a total imbalance of power there. Whereas here, what we have, a power imbalance where you have, an oppressive force, the government, cracking down and marginalizing a small group of people. And they went in an act of civil disruption to be recognized.
Yeah.
And I mean, we've had that here in Vancouver. There's been times where, the council chambers of the mayor of Vancouver have been stormed by protesters, whether it was Indigenous rights, whether it was anti-casino protesters. There's been times where they felt like they weren't being recognized, and council chambers got stormed, right?
Yeah.
And in civil disruption, that's okay. Nobody would, in a democratic country, nobody would say that these people are being seditious. They're actually doing this. They're undertaking this action for the improvement of their own country, right? And that gets lost in this.
Facts. Actually, that's a concept that I was introduced to by my sister, that dissent is the greatest form of patriotism, like, right? Because in order to dissent, in order to speak out, you have to care about something strongly enough to put your head out there on the chopping block. If you don't dissent, there's no growth. And I think when democracies or wannabe democracies shut down on dissent, they shut down on that potential to grow and get better.
Absolutely. And I mean, even us sitting in diaspora, we wouldn't have activated if it wasn't for love and care for our people and their rights and wanting them to grow and prosper, right? And the sad thing is that when you look at the diasporic activity, whether it's Ask India Why or the many protests and rallies that have taken place, throughout the world, Indian government and Godi media painted all of this as hateful acts, right? Our Ask India Why campaign was called hate speech, right? And was called seditious. And when you look at the campaign, you look at the materials, there was nothing anti-India even in there. There was nothing even anti-national or anti-Hindu or anything like that. It was only calling for the support of our people. It was only trying to highlight the fact that we don't want violence enacted on our people, right? And if an act of radical love can be contorted into hate speech, right, by media, then that media is corrupt, and their agenda is something besides informing the people or upholding any journalistic standards.
Yeah, an act of radical love. I like that statement. I hear you. I mean, the attacks of by Godi media and by their like on the Bucks have now just gone insane. Like I was watching a Z News clip where they were showing a BJP rally and like nobody showed up, and the same guy who started by calling the farmers, I think it's something Goswami, like he was calling the protesters that they were anti-national and stuff. He's the one saying that nobody showed up to the BJP rally because of COVID guidelines and they were spread out. Like that's the extent they go to propagate government propaganda. Now, Mo, so you've devoted your life pretty much to advocacy work, right? What do you find most difficult, and in what you do, and now with the farmers protest, like in advocating for it, what has been your most like not only challenging times, but where do you constantly see an issue?
It's in fear. Um, Look, when we're advocating for anything that has to do with oppression in India, we're not out there trying to convince, the rabid Hindu nationalists that are sending us like hate mail all the time, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we get like hateful content from people, right? They're
Mm-hmm.
calling for our death, they're calling for our murders. We get pictures of shaheeds from 1984 sent to us as reminders, as in like, remember 1984? We'll do it again. So we're on the receiving end of all that, and we're not trying to convince those people, right? I think the only time it gets a little frustrating is when, even in diaspora, we have aspects of our community that are fearful, right? And to me, that's an extension of India's oppression, right? It's like the base of their oppression is definitely subcontinent, but then they have these tentacles out into diaspora, right?
Mm-hmm.
And nobody in the diaspora wants to be exiled from a place that they know and love and have such a deep connection with, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody is fearing exile, and exile shows up in visas not getting approved, right? And so that is actually the greatest point of frustration, is like there's more to be said, there's more to be done, right? But in diaspora, we have a section of the community that still has that little voice in their ear and still has that little monkey on their back saying, do some, but not too much, because
Mm-hmm.
you might not get to go to India again, right? And that tends to be a bit of a wet blanket on our activity sometimes, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it
Mm-hmm.
puts the onus on a small and vocal population to put themselves out there and put themselves at risk.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if the community, spoke up more and more collectively,
Uh-huh.
actually nobody would be at risk, right?
Facts.
Because they can't stop millions of us, right?
Yeah.
But they can zero in on the dozen or so in certain locales that India feels are too loud, and they can blacklist them and do various things to try to hurt them in
Mm-hmm.
diaspora, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some of this is happening, right? Like we're seeing weird rallies by pro India supporters being conducted outside of Gurdwara, for God's sakes, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Um,
And what they're trying to do is they're trying to project and trigger more of that fear, right? So I think everything else we can handle, right? And by and large, we live with so much privilege in the democracies that we live in.
mm-hmm.
Canada is a problematic country. Absolutely. It's got its own issues, 100%. But we
Mm-hmm.
still have the privilege of being bodily and socially safe in this space, right?
Mm-hmm.
But India does whatever they can to project fear into this space. And unfortunately, I think too much of our community actually buys into it because they're afraid of being exiled.
Huh. I agree. Um, Also, don't you think it's wild that the Indian government is legit paying people to protest in front of community centers? Like you've heard of like communities protesting outside of governments, and like I, as a community member belonging to the Sikh diaspora, I am protesting in front of the Indian consulate against the government. Like this is the first time that we've witnessed governments protesting people, like citizens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's in diaspora. I think this is them really losing the plot, right? Because protests happen against the seat of power, right?
Yeah,
And they'll happen in front of the consulates because the consulate isn't a mandir, it's not a masjid, right?
yeah,
It's a seat of power and it's a representation. It's a symbol. It's a symbolic representation of that seat of power, right? But for protesters to show up outside of Gurdwara and try to provoke our community,
yeah.
I mean, you've completely lost the plot when you're going to the place that is the seat of Miri Piri for us and is where Sarbatapala is projected from. right?
Mm-hmm.
You've completely lost the plot when you're protesting those spaces. And it's tactical, right? They're looking for confrontation. They're looking to, trigger our community by our own traumas.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, in some cases, they've been successful, right? Because I think if I was at a Gurdwara and I myself, no matter how rational and reasonable I think I am, right?
Uh-huh.
If I was at a
Uh-huh.
Gurdwara and I'm exiting and I saw a bunch of, anti-farmers protest people on the doors of the Gurdwara protesting that space, I think I would get triggered, right?
I would get triggered. Yeah, absolutely. But do you think that they're actually trying to intimidate us, or do you actually think the Indian government is so far pushed into a corner and they've lost the plot and don't know what the hell to do now? Because what they've always kind of owned, like their public image was what? Like the largest democracy in the world. And that image is now like going to just, it's being torn into shreds.
Mm-hmm.
Or do you think it's their like last kind of efforts to like hold on to like some semblance of like, yes, we have some power left in us?
I don't even think it's like a last semblance. I think this is straight out of their playbook, right? Actually, I think delegitimizing our community,
Mm-hmm.
delegitimizing our people has been done for a long time, right? They've done that to our culture, to our language, to our spirituality. So
Mm-hmm.
I think what is being attempted is to trigger our community to perhaps, respond in a impolite manner
Yep.
and through that to delegitimize us and therefore delegitimize our message. So I believe it's all tactical, and
Mm-hmm.
I think they're just going by their playbook. And what I would encourage our community members to do is stay focused on the goal, right?
Yep.
We don't need to critique each other because
Mm-hmm.
we're not oppressing each other. The oppressor is somebody else. So maintain focus on the oppressor, and that even means, unfortunately, not being reactionary to the pro-India nationalists that we're having to encounter in our cities here in diaspora, right? Unfortunately, it's tough, but we can't react to them because they're here to distract from what the real message, is, and that is that violence and oppression is coming from the government of India.
Facts. Hold on, you just mentioned something that I wanted to talk more about. Um, I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
No worries.
Um,
No worries.
um, thanks. Um, okay, so you brought up the thought of like the RSS branches here. Um, I don't know how to put this question. So in the US, our RSS has tried to infiltrate the federal government. We have RSS people in very powerful places in corporate America, and they kind of prejudice against uh, minority communities like the Dalit community, and kind of to keep them out of positions that can help them move forward. How much of a problem do you think, because in England, like it's very obvious how much they've infiltrated the federal government there. We have Jaggi Johal that's still in an Indian prison, and the British government is doing jack shit about that. We have 3 Sikhs in England, that are going through the extradition process. How
Mm-hmm.
much of a threat do you think RSS and their cronies are in America and Canada and other developed nations?
So I think it's huge, and maybe more so in Canada even than other places, right? There was a book that came out in the 80s that talked about 1984 and the Air India tragedy out of Canada, and the book was actually called Soft Target. And the reason it was called Soft Target was because that was a label that showed up in Indian intelligence documents in reference to Canada, right? They looked at Canada as literally as being a soft target, like a marshmallow. Like it's really easy to poke into this thing, right? And
Uh-huh.
and Canada is kind of like a diplomatic marshmallow, right? Like India runs circles around us out here,
Yeah.
absolutely runs circles around us. Like they, got reports published equating Sikh activism to Khalistani violence, and
Mm-hmm.
actually got it published, right? They
Mm-hmm.
managed to get the Canadian government to declare that Sikhs still had extremist and violent tendencies in
Mm-hmm.
Canada, right? They later repealed that because nobody knew how that got introduced. But later on, it came out that there's basically BJP connections that were introducing the sort of language through policy, through document, all of these channels that are meant to look official, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I don't even think it has to be like RSS formally. I
Uh-huh.
think I think there's many informal channels that from a policy basis and literature perspective, are seeking to delegitimize us.
Hmm.
And in diaspora, we even see it culturally, where there's still caste dynamics at play, right?
Hmm.
Like just taking a total tangent for a second, like there was a controversy last year when it came out that Cisco, a multi-billion-dollar massive networking company, that
Hmm.
there was like internal communications there that were highly casteist about who would or wouldn't be a part of the company or get promoted based on Brahmanical structures and caste lines, right? So culturally, it gets propagated, and then even institutionally, it gets propagated because you do have actors, in diaspora that are seeking to delegitimize us, and we're having to be hyper vigilant and fight so many battles across so many different fronts.
Yeah. I didn't know about the soft marshmallow concept in Canada. I always thought that um England, because they actually for some England for some reason always I've felt has this kind of sensitivity to Sikhs, and I think it's historical before like around the East India Company days, like because the Sikh Empire was the last one that they got into, and I think this kind of like oppress the Sikhs before they overpower us kind of concept is very, very strong within like British high society. But um, in America, in Canada, I always thought that there was kind of a more like I don't know how to explain this, like a secular kind of mindset, whereas like we're not going to kind of gang up so purposely against one community.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I am seeing in this, especially in California, where the Indian diaspora and who may have certain amount of ties to like the Hindutva community and like the Sangh of them, like
Mm-hmm.
trying to get certain congressmen into office, like Tulsi Gabbard
Mm-hmm.
was a major one. But I don't know, like what do you see as the solution for this?
I don't think it's any single solution, right? Because
Yeah.
it goes back to that thing that I talked about earlier about projecting this idea into the future, right?
Hmm.
I think our culture and communicating our value systems, right? Whether that's of the Punjabi community or of Sikh way of life and that Sikh value system. I think that's the most important thing we can do, right? Because what we found in our own history, if we look back 500 years, the most resilient thing hasn't been our physical bodies or our borders, right? The most resilient thing has been our ideas. The most resilient thing has been our inspiration and our spirit.
Hmm.
And that spirit, those ideas, that culture of revolution, that culture of resistance and justice, that
Hmm.
continues to persist, right?
Hmm.
And so the job of the oppressor is going to be to oppress, right? They're doing their job. And I think we need to do our job, which is to revolt.
Yeah, facts. Okay, so we're hitting an hour. Should we take some questions?
Let's do it.
All right, guys. So send in your questions and let's see. All right. Nobody's sending in questions yet. Anybody have any questions? As a community, we need to stick together, Ashmeet. Waiting, waiting. Remy, do you have any questions? Oh, my cousin's asking you to write a book.
I would love to. I'm just too distracted.
All right, I have a question.
Mhm.
What is the correct way to spell Bronte?
Okay, so I've spelled it Poarnthe. I've also done an AY on the end, but I mean, I'm sorry, I had to call you out. The bougiest spelling of Bronte I've ever seen is yours. Pronte. It's like it's a brand, but I mean, I kind of like it. It's shorter, but I think I'm gonna go with Bronte your way from now on, actually.
Yeah, they taste better. Anyways, so thank you so much, Mo, for joining me today. And I'm so proud of the work that you're doing because I really do believe that like you're making a huge impact.
Well, thank you.
So,
And I think if I was going to leave a parting message, and I just saw a comment on this as well, is this idea of the third Punjab. This isn't just a fancy metaphor, right? This is a lived reality, and we're seeing it and feeling the effects of it now more than ever, right? Technology, digital spaces, these are all enablers for us to connect in a way that we never have before. And so my ask to anyone and everyone that is on this live feed now or in the future is to find connections, right? I mean, we have so much love to give and receive, and you will surprise yourself. Like we surprised ourselves when we reached out just through grassroots networks and said, hey, does anybody know some Punjabis in Australia or other places? I mean, the amount of love that we got and connection and people taking their time out and showing up. You know, we had people on our calls that for them it was 3 or 4 in the morning, and they stayed up to make sure that they connected with us, right? So I think my ask to our community is going to be to, you know, strengthen yourselves wherever you are, but reach out and connect with other players in diaspora around the world, because I think the third Punjab is a powerful force, and we're seeing the effects of it today.
Facts. Someone just said that the unity is what's going to move this forward.
And the greatest lie that we've come to believe about ourselves is that we're not unified, right? You don't have this many people in this many locations rising up with one voice unless you are inherently unified. We always have been. We just over time came to realize and believe the lie that was told about ourselves, that we're not, right? We are one spirit. We're one people. We always have been. We always will be. We just can't believe the lies that are told about us.
Facts. So I think we actually do have questions now.
Oh, great.
Okay, so GS_Tour is asking, how does the Sikh resistance of the 80s relate to the farmers' protest?
So this kind of came up in a really problematic way when we talked about Khalistan at all, right? So the resistance that was actually started even before the 80s and the 70s onwards, it was quite basic. When you look at the Anandpur Sahib resolution and what our people were asking for, they were asking for our rights over our waters, right? Rights over our land, right to be recognized as distinct from Hindus, which we're not, right? To have rights over our own spiritual spaces, which in Punjab we don't have those. And so they were asking for such basic rights, right? And they were met with such violent and brutal resistance for that. So now I think anybody that is seeing what's happening with the farmers' protest, all of it harkens back to that period, right? Because the demands have been consistent this whole time, and the farmers' protest, we just see the latest example of the policies that were meant to hurt us in the 70s and in the 80s and the 90s. This is just the latest example of that, right?
Yeah.
So that's why, like, I don't necessarily take a position on whether something like Khalistan should happen or not, right? But what I always argue for is any group of people that wants to fight for their self-determination. It is an internationally recognized human right for any group to seek self-determination in a democratic society, right? You're allowed to seek that for yourself. And so my argument is that our people should be able to seek that for themselves as well, right? And whether that's in this moment or whether that's in the 80s, if you're going to call yourself a democracy, then you need to provide democratic rights. And if we can't achieve those, then that means we're not actually members of that society.
Facts. You actually, in one of your speeches, said that it's not over when these farm bills get repealed. Like when our grandparents go back to Punjab, they are facing a water crisis. Punjab has the highest rate of cancer in all of India. The issues are huge. Punjab's going to be a desert, and I think it's estimated in the next 20 years, like the groundwater levels are decreasing. And I always say this, that it's very important to know what's going on. It's very important to know your history, your religious history. It's very important to know Punjab's history. It's very important to know what the issues at hand are. You can't, because if you're oblivious, it's very easy to kind of brainwash you into believing something else, right? It's because we know what is going on, what has happened. Like, that's why we were able to recognize that these laws were bad, right? If we didn't have that knowledge of history and what has happened, and Congress came in and did this, and then this happened, and the British had done this back then, like, we wouldn't know how these laws would affect us now and where they're coming from.
Absolutely. And I mean, and Punjab sacrificed its future, not now, but in the 60s, right? When the Green Revolution happened, we gave up our native crops, our indigenous crops, right? We gave up our waters, and we even gave up our soil because we introduced crops that needed intense fertilization, intense pesticides. And we did that to stave off a famine that was going to, at the time estimated to wipe out 50 million people, right? So Punjab sacrificed itself for the subcontinent many, many times, right? And this is an old sacrifice of the 60s that our people undertook to feed a nation, right? To feed the
Mm-hmm.
entire subcontinent.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what actually makes the introduction of the farm laws, so much more grotesque, right? It's that
Mm-hmm.
after all the sacrifice, after everything that this culture did for the subcontinent, now
Mm-hmm.
you introduce structurally violent bills meant to wipe out their entire way of life, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like the absolute, I think, biggest betrayal you could enact through legislation.
Facts. Alrighty. Well, we've hit an hour. So thank you so much, Mo, for joining us today. I really, really appreciate you giving me your time.
No, thank you, Monica. It was fun. I appreciated this.
Thank you. You have a good one. Enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, you too.
Bye bye.